We're going to be looking at two issues this week. We're going to be looking at the so-called problem of evil, and we'll talk about why it is a problem, why a lot of people believe it's a problem, and we'll talk about two Asian religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. And these two things, as we'll see, are not interrelated and not unrelated, I should say. And interestingly, Hinduism and Buddhism develop quite interesting perspectives on how to think about evil, Buddhism in particular. So we'll talk about that in due course. And as we'll see, the framework is very different from the understanding of religion in the Western tradition, which focuses very much on the idea of an all-powerful, omnipotent, monotheistic idea of God. Monotheistic meaning the God is only there is only one God, and God is supposed to be separate from, transcendent to the world. Asian religions, those two that we'll look at, Hinduism and Buddhism, have a somewhat different perspective. So we'll try to develop that difference as we go through. So the first thing we're going to look at is the problem of evil. Evil. Now, by evil, we are talking about the existence of I suppose we would say extreme cases of human suffering, very very grave human suffering, and the fact that there is considerable suffering in the world. So the so-called problem of evil refers to the supposed difficulty of reconciling the fact of evil in the world with the existence of God. In other words, there is said to be a difficulty in getting those two facts on the same page, that there is considerable evil in the world and that God exists. And as we'll see, the argument from evil says that we can't have both of those things. If there is considerable evil in the world, then it must mean as a consequence that God does not exist. God as we conceive of God, or as God is conceived in the major, Western religious traditions, Judaism and Christianity, etc., that concept of God is untenable. It doesn't hold water if the fact of there being considerable evil is true. So the argument from evil is sometimes said to be an argument that supports the position of atheism, that is to say, the position that argues there is no God, God does not exist, or agnosticism, the claim that we can never know whether God exists or not. So the argument from evil is often described as a positive argument in favor of the non-existence of God. Now, this I think shares with the arguments that we talked about last time, cosmological arguments and the design arguments, the fact of sort of being a little bit too intellectual. That is to say, it doesn't really address the idea of religious experience, and the same reasons why we would say, I think, that there is something not quite convincing about the cosmological and the design arguments as arguments for the existence of God would lead us to say there is something not entirely convincing about the argument from evil as an argument against the existence of God. I don't think it is entirely successful as an argument, and we'll talk about some of the arguments for and against. Now, remember, in saying that an argument doesn't succeed, it doesn't mean that we are refuting the position which this argument wants to argue for. Right? In other words, it doesn't mean, if the argument from evil does not succeed, it doesn't mean that atheism is false. All it means is that the argument from evil does not satisfactorily and successfully support the position of atheism. Now, there may be another argument that we haven't mentioned, or perhaps another point of view, another perspective that does successfully and adequately argue for atheism, but the argument from evil, at least, isn't successful in doing that. So that's when we reject an argument. What I'm trying to say is that we reject this argument as a way of successfully reaching a conclusion. It doesn't automatically mean that you have to throw out the position, or that position is false. There may be other ways of getting to that position. And that holds of whichever position you are on. And it may be that, like I said, we'll find none of the philosophical arguments convincing, but there may be other perspectives or arguments that do lead us successfully to one position or the other. So let's take a look at this argument in more detail. Now, the root of the problem of evil, the argument from evil, is found in these four propositions. And as we'll see, the claim that's made is that there is something contradictory about affirming, about, in other words, saying that you agree with all four of these statements. There is said to be something that's contradictory about that. We cannot accept all four of them. So let's just run through what they are. The first one is a claim about God's so-called benevolence or goodness. And it states simply, as the Western monotheistic idea of God argues, God is perfectly good. In other words, God is benevolent. God is not a being that does evil things. Okay? God is good. God is directed towards the achievement of the maximum goodness. Secondly, God is said to be, again, part of the tradition, God is said to be all-knowing, what's also called, from the Latin, omniscient. God is omniscient. God knows everything. Okay? And sometimes that's sort of extended as a claim that God knows everything that's going to happen in the future, as well as everything that happened in the past and is happening in the present. God knows everything that happens and that will happen. And the third statement says that, and again, part of the tradition, God is all-powerful. Sometimes said as that God is omnipotent. Again, all-powerful. So the idea here is that God can do anything that God wants to do. There is nothing that would prevent God from intervening or changing something that God wanted to change. Okay? Now the fourth argument simply states, look around the world and all the suffering, and you have to say that evil exists. Okay, evil exists. Now, I said that there's a contradiction, or said to be a contradiction here, between affirming these four statements. And the contradiction lies in the first three in relation to the fourth one, that evil exists. So let's just see if we can spell that out in more detail. Now, here's the key claim. Number 5 would say, if God exists, and God is a being who is good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, as stated in 1 to 3, then there would be no evil in the world. Right? In other words, if God is a being who is good, who is dedicated to the existence of good rather than evil, okay? So if God wants there to be good rather than evil in the world. Secondly, if God is all-knowing, it means that God knows when there is evil. God is aware when an evil act, not only that it is happening, but more strongly we could even say when it is going to happen. So God is all-knowing and knows when evil happens and when it is going to happen at any point in the world and in our lives. And thirdly, God is all-powerful, meaning that at any time when God is aware of evil, God could stop that evil from happening. Okay? Now, it's suggested that if those three things are true, then that's exactly what God would do. Right? If God is perfectly good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, God would stop evil from happening. Therefore, there would be no evil in the world. So the conclusion that's drawn, if we accept 4, then we have to accept, therefore, God does not exist. Now, that means God in the sense of propositions 1 to 3. So it is allegedly a proof that if evil exists, then there cannot be a God of the form that is stated in propositions 1 to 3. That is to say, a God that is perfectly good, a God that is all-knowing, omniscient, and a God that is all-powerful or omnipotent. Right? Those three propositions are incompatible with the fact of there being evil in the world. So let's see if we can sort of make sense of that and see what the response to that argument would be from somebody who is sympathetic to propositions 1 to 3 and somebody who is an opponent of the argument. The basic idea behind the argument from evil is to appeal to our sort of sensibility and our sense of the wrongness of suffering, of the obviously the harm caused to human beings by suffering, and to say, well, if you were a being who was all good, who sort of cared about eliminating suffering, who was very much hurt by suffering, and who had the power to prevent suffering from happening, wouldn't you do everything in your power to stop a child from suffering? Okay? And of course, if you're all-powerful, then you have that power to stop a child from suffering. So, if as a parent you would do that, of course, if the idea of God is sort of a parent writ large, a super benevolent and all-powerful and all-knowing parent, if that's how we think of the God idea, if that's how we think of God, then we would have to say, so the argument goes, God would automatically intervene to stop a child from suffering whenever it occurs. So in that sense, the argument, appeals to our intuitions and says, if this is what our idea of God is like, then God would be compelled to intervene to stop that suffering from happening. But of course, we know that in the real world, children do suffer. Children do suffer in a multitude of ways, from neglect and abuse from other humans. They suffer from natural disasters like famines. They suffer a series of unfortunate accidents, and of course they suffer from genetic diseases and malformations as well that make them suffer. So here's the thing. If there was a God as conceptualized in the Western tradition, so the argument claims, God would want to stop that suffering. Now, before we look at the response, let's get clear on the two types of evil that we're talking about here. And the first type is called natural evil. And natural evil refers to suffering that is explicitly a result of so-called natural causes. And that just means anything that's not caused by human action. So that would be things like earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, genetic diseases, etc. So anything which is not the deliberate consequence of human action. So that there are a series of things, of course, which human actions can't be blamed for. Those are the result of natural causes. The December 2004 tsunami that destroyed large parts of Southeast Asia was a tragic example of natural evil, where just the power of nature caused such destruction that we were unable to stop, and resulted in hundreds of thousands of lives lost and everything else. So that's natural evil. That's natural evil. The idea of a suffering that is a result of natural causes. Now, the second type of evil is moral evil, as personified by Dr. Evil. And of course, all of the more seriously, all of the ways in which human beings can do evil things, from sort of evil political leaders, people like you might want to put into that category Hitler, Pol Pot, and other leaders, from individuals who perform acts that result in suffering to other people, serial killers, rapists, etc. Moral evil refers to suffering that is the result of the direct result of the actions of human beings, including things like murder, rape, and torture. So that's moral evil, where it's human intervention that brings about the suffering concerned. That is moral evil. Now, the first response to the problem of evil from the theist perspective, that is, from the perspective of somebody who believes in God's existence, is the greater good's defense. And the greater good's defense says that the existence of some evil is simply necessary in order to achieve a greater good. So, without evil, we would be unable to achieve this greater good, of which, unfortunately, we have to have some evil in order to get there. More specifically, we could say if there were no evil in the world, it would not be possible to develop desirable human traits. Things that are precisely cultivated in a world in which there are obstacles to face, in which there is evil to be confronted. That is to say, human traits like courage, forbearance, compassion, fortitude, forgiveness, etc. In other words, we would not become the very deep moral characters that we are if it weren't for the fact that evil exists. So evil exists in order to serve a greater good. More generally, it's often said that the conception of the world as sort of like a place where we demonstrate our characters, where we face challenges, and a lot of people have that conception of life as being something where something which is character developing and so on. And as we'll see, John Hicks has a perspective of that sort as well. And of course, if there were no evil, then there would be nothing to develop our characters. There would be no challenges for us to face which would enable us to overcome and become morally developed and morally sophisticated people. So John Hicks is one of the most famous defenders of the greater good's defense, and he claims that a person who has become good by meeting and mastering temptations and making responsible choices is good in a richer sense than somebody who is in a state of innocence. That is to say, you can be a good person who has never had to face making difficult choices or being in a situation where you had to master an important conflict within yourself. You can just be somebody who has, never had to face difficult choices and to become good in a more complex sense. And he says that it's only if we see the world as a place that poses us challenges, and that includes the challenges posed by the very extreme challenges of the existence of evil. It's only where those challenges exist that we can become those more complex, richer moral persons who respond to adversity and develop and really realize our richer moral characters by how we respond to adversity and how we respond to the evil around us. And so Hicks says that human goodness slowly built up through personal histories of moral effort has a value in the eyes of the Creator which justifies even the long travail, the long work of the soul-making process. So it's the way human goodness is a result of these histories of effort that sort of justifies the existence of evil in the way that it contributes to, in the way that it is an indispensable part of the achievement of human goodness. And that process, Hicks calls it soul-making. In other words, it's the struggle against obstacles and adversity and everything else that allows us to engage in this process of soul-making, where we, through strenuous moral efforts, we become more sophisticated and deeper and richer moral persons. And of course, if there were no moral challenges to face, we wouldn't have the opportunity to develop that part of our character. So here, evil is seen as something which serves the greater good of this soul-making process. So it's not that life is supposed to be something that is completely without adversity and without challenges. It's not supposed to be a child's playground. It's something where those challenges force us to build our personalities and our characters. And Hicks calls that process soul-making. Now, there are two important criticisms of the greater good's defense. So let's look at those two criticisms here. The first important criticism states and asks us, do we really need as much evil as there is in the world for soul making? And the idea here is that some things are evil to excess, that there's just some sort of arbitrary, completely contingent evil that we could in effect do away with and still leave the conditions for soul making. Think of things like arbitrary freak accidents, like a child that falls out of a 10-story window, or a young infant that's run over by a bus. Those sort of things seem to be suffering that is just in excess of what would be needed for soul making. And so the idea is that if God could prevent this suffering, and of course God being good would want to prevent this suffering, why not prevent this excess of suffering that just seems to be too much for us to handle and doesn't seem to serve soul making at all? What about those acts of evil that just seem to be excessive? Surely the case of an infant dying in a freak accident is something that we would say, well, that's just too much, right? There's too much evil there. Let there be some evil, but not as much as there currently is. Or very extreme acts of evil. So this is the issue. Now I think John Hicks has a fairly good response to this, insofar as he would say, well, it's just not plausible and realistic to think that God could intervene in certain cases where it looks to be extreme evil and not throw the whole process out of whack, and not sort of not change the whole idea of our relation to the world. And Hicks would say, I think, that we depend in our actions and we depend in our choices, and the whole idea of character building depends upon there being a sort of stable natural order that we can count on. And of course, if God sort of intervened when things got extremely bad or arbitrary accidents happened, then we would lose our confidence in that sort of natural order. We would lose our confidence in the natural laws of the world and everything else. So Hicks would say, well, look, you just can't expect God to arbitrarily intervene when, a child falls out of a window or something like this. That, you just have to accept the world as it is, and the world as it is one where there is considerable evil. And, you can't have soul making without that evil, and you also can't expect God to intervene when, evil becomes especially evil. You just got to let the world as it has been set up and constructed, you just got to let it run its course and accept that there is evil, and that evil makes soul making possible. So that's the first objection. And the second objection states that much evil seems to contribute to soul breaking rather than soul making. Think of very extreme acts of evil like genocide, or think of the tsunami that destroys whole villages and whole communities. This seems to be evil to such an extent that it crushes us so much that it prevents us from finding any greater good in the evil itself, that it breaks our souls rather than helps us to make them stronger. So there seems to be the argument against the greater good's defense here would be that there is some evil which is just, again, which doesn't help us to become more richer, moral persons, but which crushes us. And you never know, in fact, when evil happens, which it's going to be. Now, of course, Hicks could well say here, well, that's the whole point. If soul making was easy, then it loses the whole point of the exercise. If it wasn't a difficult thing, if sometimes you didn't, fail in that act of soul making, then there would be no point. So Hicks would have a response to this one as well, and you can sort of think for yourself about which perspective you find convincing here. Now, the free will defense says that God could not create creatures like humans who have freedom of the will but who are incapable of doing evil. So the idea is that specifically we are creatures who, a fundamental part of who we are is that we have freedom to make choices. And we are morally responsible for the choices that we make. And the argument goes that we could not have that freedom to make choices, and we couldn't have that moral character that we have without also having the capability of doing evil. Okay? So having freedom of the will means that unfortunately we have to accept that some people will use that freedom to do evil things. But you couldn't take that away without taking away freedom of the will as well. So our freedom, our very human freedom, necessitates that as a sort of side effect we're going to have cases where people will do evil. So moral evil will exist. So the idea is we have to accept the bad things that happen. We have to accept all the bad things that happen in the world. Things like, murderous dictators who kill thousands, millions of people, like Hitler, Stalin, and also things like natural disasters that, kill thousands of people. We have to accept that bad things can happen, and they happen as an unavoidable side effect of the existence of everything in the world that is good. So if we didn't have the bad, if we didn't construct people who could do evil things, then we wouldn't be able to celebrate and enjoy everything that is good in the world. Leaders for peace and human freedom like Mahatma Gandhi. People who extend our enjoyment and appreciation of the world through art like Michelangelo. And people who demonstrate courage and desirable human qualities, firefighters being one example, who show that they make choices that demonstrate their moral responsibility and demonstrate desirable human qualities and traits. So, if we didn't have the ability to do bad, then we couldn't have the good either. So the possibility of evil, according to this argument, is very simply the flip side of everything that makes the world a good and enjoyable place. Everything that makes the world a place where there are significant human accomplishments. And of course that depends on freedom of the will. But we couldn't have that if there wasn't also the possibility of doing evil. Now just think for a minute, what would a world be like in which God refused to allow people to do evil things? Okay? In other words, whenever evil was about to occur, right, let's suppose that God decided that God wasn't going to allow evil things to happen, and he was going to stop that from happening. So let's take, a homicidal maniac wielding a hammer, and is about to do some very serious damage to another person. Okay. Now at this point, before the homicidal maniac can actually use the hammer and sort of bring it down upon the other person's skull, God, being all-knowing, all-powerful, and of course benevolent, interested in human welfare, decides to intervene. And just before the hammer is brought down, it transforms itself into a lightweight and very innocuous plastic hammer. And of course the person who wants to do evil finds themselves incapable of doing so. And of course similar for whatever instrument you decide to use. If you wanted to shoot somebody, well, that would turn into a water pistol. So, what would this world be like when God refused to allow people to do evil things? Is that really, as the argument from evil suggests, is that really a desirable scenario? Is that really a desirable scenario? And the free will defense, I think, is at its strongest when we take it to be saying that, look, you just have to accept that there will be, people will make bad choices and do evil things. But if you want to prevent that from happening, right, if you want, every time somebody's going to do something evil, if you want to stop them, then you take away the human possibility of free will, right? You take away our responsibility to make choices and to be responsible, to be morally responsible for the choices that we make. Now, an interesting perspective comes from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued that it's not suffering that human beings find unbearable, but meaningless suffering. In other words, it's not so much the fact that we suffer, but suffering in such a way that we can't find a meaning in the suffering. So the question that Nietzsche wants us to ask is, does religion help us to give a meaning to our suffering? Is it difficult for us to accept that our suffering might be ultimately without purpose? And is that, the most difficult thing of all for us to accept? In other words, as Nietzsche sees it, that one of the points of religion, perhaps a central part of religion, is to give a meaning to the way that we suffer. Whether that means telling us that there's ultimately a reward for suffering, or perhaps there's ultimately something that will be gained by the way that we suffer. But ultimately, religion tells us that our suffering is not in vain, that there is a greater purpose for us and for the world that is served by our suffering. That our suffering will be redeemed at some point in the future. Now, Nietzsche's skeptical about that claim, at least the religious claim, but it's interesting that he does link together the existence of suffering and finding a response to suffering with the idea of religion, and in an interesting way. So you might want to think about how you feel about Nietzsche's claim. Now let's shift tack, in fact, and let's look at two Eastern philosophies. Hinduism, the first one, and then we'll take a look at Buddhism. Now, like I said, there's a difference here with Western traditions. So let's take a look at that first. The Hindu concept of Brahman is opposed to the Western idea of the transcendence of God. That is, God as being something beyond and separate to the world, and the Western idea of the separation of God and creation. Okay? The idea that God is separable from creation, and in fact God comes before creation. According to the Hindu perspective, God is immanent in creation, meaning that you can't pull them apart. They're one and the same thing. Okay? God is simply a part of creation, or God unfolds within creation itself. Central to Hinduism is the idea of what's called the veil of Maya. And the central idea is that the world of our experience, although we're not saying it's simply an illusion, in other words, it's sort of a created illusion that you can throw away, it doesn't put us in touch with the truth about reality. So, living in our daily lives behind this veil of Maya, we're not in touch with the deeper truth about what the world is really like. Now, the idea in Hinduism is that from behind the veil of Maya, in the way we live our daily lives, the world appears to us as fragmented. In other words, it's separated into separate individual substances. And of course, us as individual human beings are some of those separate substances. So there's a sort of fragmentation, and we take ourselves to be sort of separate individuals. Now, that sense of the self as a separate individual is part of living behind the veil of Maya, according to the Hindu tradition. When you think of yourself with your own identity and independent destiny, with your own plans and goals, and being a separate person from the rest of creation, that's part of living behind the veil of Maya. And the deeper sense of self, the deeper reality of the self, is what in the Hindu tradition is called the Atman, the changing, temporal, and insubstantial self. In other words, it's not, it's in a sense it's illusory. It's not in touch with the deeper truth about the world. That self is called Jiva. Now, the Atman is not an individual identity. In other words, our deeper self is not, our deeper individual self. It's rather our participation in the soul of the universe as a whole. So, the deeper identity beyond the veil of Maya Remember, the veil of Maya individualizes us. But the deeper identity beyond that veil is ourselves as part of the one great universe as a whole, and our participation in the whole. So if you think of it as that behind the veil of Maya we're all sort of divided and we see ourselves as separate in individual substances and so on, when we're in touch with our deeper identity, and Hinduism is about finding that contact with our deeper identity, we see ourselves as one with the universe as a whole. Now, karma is an important part of the Hindu tradition because it suggests that everything we do and think shapes our future experiences. And it's an essential part of why we're called upon to act morally, according to Hinduism. It's linked to the idea of reincarnation, and it says that everything that we do affects not only our current condition but also our future lives. So our future lives, as well as our present, are affected by things that we do in this life. So, how we fare and the choices that we make will affect how we are, the forms and the shapes that our lives will take in the future, in our current life, and also beyond through reincarnation. So, karma is really, a lot of people say that it's like saying that what goes around comes around. In other words, your actions will eventually come back to you, and through reincarnation will be brought back to you at some future point. So that there's an essential sort of imperative in Hinduism for moral conduct, which comes from the fact that fundamentally it's in our own interest, because everything that we do will come back to us in the future. Now, the ultimate goal in Hinduism is to attain moksha, or liberation, from this process of rebirth and the submission to the moral and finite conditions of existence. Liberation would mean that we're no longer sort of part of this cycle of life and rebirth, so that we're sort of constantly living in the process of paying for our mistakes and our past decisions and everything else. Once we escape that cycle, once we're liberated from that cycle, we attain one with the fundamental reality of the universe. We become one with Brahman. So that's the ultimate goal of existence and thought according to Hinduism. Now, Buddhism is actually a sort of an early offshoot of the Hindu tradition, and it's founded on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who later became known as Buddha, a title which means the Enlightened One. Interesting and important things about Buddhism is that it involves a rejection of materialism, that is, the pursuit of material happiness as the goal of life. And of course that includes the pursuit of sort of a consumerist lifestyle, but also the idea that gaining material comfort is the ultimate goal of life. But it's also at the same time a rejection of extreme asceticism or self-denial. And that of course comes from the Buddha's own experience with Hindu asceticism and his sort of rejection of that path. So if you take the two extremes to be materialism and asceticism on the other hand, so self-indulgence and self-denial, Buddhism is founded on a rejection of both of those extremes. Buddhism affirms the transitory and ephemeral nature of everything that exists. And the point here is that once we understand that everything is fleeting and perishing, we will no longer look to the physical world for our fulfillment. So the self and the world are both transitory, they change, and also ephemeral, they're short-lived. Once we understand that, then we no longer sort of look for our fulfillment in things that take place in the physical world, because we know that they don't last. And that could mean, again, material wealth. It could mean, our jobs and looking for fulfillment in promotion and career satisfaction. It could mean in our personal lives. Once we understand that all of those things pass away, that they don't last, we'll no longer look for fulfillment in that realm. So there's a similarity here, as you can see, to the Hindu idea of the veil of Maya. According to Buddhism, there is something untrue, something superficial about everything in the physical world around us, and to look for fulfillment in the world around us is a mistake and takes us away from the deeper source of enjoyment. Now, Buddhism has an interesting perspective, like I said at the beginning, on the idea of suffering. And for Buddhism, the root of suffering concerns our desires and cravings. And basically, the idea is that because of our sort of individual desires and cravings, we're always on a frantic search to satisfy particular desires. Right? We're always led to go to the next stage, to be better than we are now, to get a better grade, to get a promotion. We're always sort of led on to the next stage. We're always craving the next satisfaction. And according to Buddhism, that's where we get into trouble. And in fact, that's the very source of suffering. Because a result of us sort of being led by our desires and cravings for more, for the next stage, the next satisfaction, the next stage on the process, the bigger house, the bigger car, or whatever it is, if it's in material terms. It's that craving that leads us to things like greed, envy, selfishness, resentment, and those kinds of things. So for Buddhism, that's where the problem lies. The suffering is largely caused by the way our desires and cravings lead us to unhappiness and to things like selfishness and resentment. And what we need to do is to escape from that cycle. So, although life can give us moments of pleasure, Buddhism says that this pleasure is always transitory. It will eventually leave us restless and empty. In other words, once we've reached that satisfaction, right? Say we buy the house of our dreams, or say we get the job promotion, or get the position that we've always wanted. It may seem like we're satisfied, like we're fulfilled, like we've achieved what we wanted to achieve, and we feel happy and contented. However, this feeling is always only momentary. It's always transitory. And eventually the craving or the desire for more, for the next step, will kick in again. And it's that process that Buddhism wants us to see as leading us away from genuine happiness. It leads us on a search that can only end up in suffering, because the distance between our desires and fulfillment is always going to be there, and it's that distance that leads us to suffer. Now, the goal of life, the final purpose in Buddhism, is to release us from this narrow concern with ourselves and with our own interests, and the desires and the cravings that make us restless, discontented, and unhappy. And there's a variety of sort of practices and ways of approaching the world and everything else, but eventually it's a practice of self-mastery. And what we're trying to do what Buddhism wants us to do is to disconnect from our desires and our cravings, and to put ourselves in touch with, the deeper source and what truly matters. And that means, again, separating from our own individual perspective, our own individual interests and desires, and finding a connection with our sort of oneness with the world as a whole. So, Buddhism calls this condition nirvana. And it's one marked by a sort of separation, a transcendence of our desires and our cravings, so that we no longer see ourselves as individuals with our own separate plans and projects, but we see ourselves as sort of one with the world as a whole, in a deeper sense. So that's where Buddhism, and again, pretty similar to Hinduism, that's where Buddhism wants to lead us. So we've talked a lot in this presentation about the idea of suffering. We've talked about the problem of evil. We looked at how the Western tradition wants to deal with this problem. We also looked at two Eastern traditions that have a very different understanding of the religious quest. And the question we want to ask is, which perspective do you think best makes sense of our experience? Are you persuaded by the Buddhist or Hindu interpretation of our suffering? What do you think about the persuasiveness of the problem of evil? What are the causes of suffering in our world? Do you think that our desires and cravings are responsible for our suffering? What about things like natural suffering as well? So which perspective has the most convincing view of the natures and causes of suffering? Those are some of the things you might want to think about as we reflect on this week's material and this week's learning module.